you think you're ready to show your track? Join the forum at www.artfxstudios.com/forum.
Hey guys, welcome back to ARTFX Tutorial Tuesday. This week, it's all about mixdowns. First of all, I want to wish all of you a Merry Christmas. But even though it's Christmas, I'm here making a new tutorial for you guys. What a lovely way to spend the first Christmas day. So today I want to talk about doing the mixdown for a track and preparing the track for mastering. This is a very important process if you want your track to sound good after mastering. Note that most of my mixing is already done during the production stage, so you won't find me adding shitloads of compressors and stuff like that, just minor tweaks and bits to spice everything up a bit. So if you take a look at the right hand side of the screen, you can see that I color-coded all my group tracks. I did this so it's easy to show what I'm going to do as a preparation for the mixdown stage. Now I could simply do the final mixdown inside this project, but since this project is becoming quite CPU heavy and I also need that processing power for the mastering stage, I'm going to do it different. I'm going to export each element of the track to an audio file, which I will then load up in a new Ableton project, which will be used for the mixdown and mastering stage. First, I'll set the latency in my ASIO driver as low as possible, just to make sure there are no weird latency issues on my exported files. After doing this, the track will sound shit if I play it, because the ASIO driver can't keep up with the information that is passed through it, and thus you'll hear weird clicks and pops in the output signal. But this will not happen on exporting. So now I can start exporting my tracks. I've grouped and color-coded everything to show you how I do this. First, the drums group track will be exported into a single audio file with just the drums and nothing else. The two percussion tracks will be exported to an audio file with both group tracks in it. Then all these synth group tracks will be exported into one audio file, just like the vocals, and all the effects tracks will go into an audio file. Then lastly, I export the mid-range bass to an audio file, and finally the sub to a separate audio file. Now I will end up with 7 audio files, which I'll load up into the new project file. After this export, you'll save yourself a lot of CPU power and also RAM memory, which will make it easier to do the mastering since you don't have to worry about your computer's processing power. It's a technique used a lot on complicated projects, but it also gives you a visual waveform to look at, which sometimes can reveal interesting things, but I'll get to that later. Also be sure that everything on the master track is turned off before exporting, so no limiter pushing the volume up or anything else. So now I select my entire track and solo the drums group track. Now I go to File, Export Audio and Video, and that will bring up the export settings. In this window you can set your preferred settings. I'll go through the most important briefly. For the render track you want to choose the master, so it picks the output of the master track and exports that to an audio file. The file type has to be WAV, so no quality is lost during the export. You also want to change the bit depth. This also helps preserving the quality. I always set my bit depth to 24-bit on all exports except the final master. That will be 16-bit. I don't want to get all tacky and stuff, but it has to do with the amount of samples in an audio file, and a higher bitrate will give you a better quality export. One thing I also add to this is I activate the normalize button. This is going to analyze the audio file and make sure that every export is peaking at 0 dB. The sample rate can be adjusted to taste. Normally you want to use 44.1 or 48. 44.1 is the standard sample rate for CDs, while 48 is the standard sample rate for music used in films and other video projects. Since I do a lot with video too, I tend to stick with 48. You can always downgrade to 44.1 afterwards. Also, you don't want any dithering going on, so turn that off. Now I can click OK at the bottom and choose a file name and destination, then hit save. After this it will start exporting your audio track, and this might take a little while. Ableton is now going to analyze the export and search for the loudest peak in the signal. Then it will bring the level up to the 0 dB mark, which is called normalizing. This makes the final mixdown a bit easier since all exported tracks will be peaking at 0 dB, but I'll explain that later. Afterwards, you want to do this for all your group of tracks that I showed earlier in this video. For now, I'll jump straight to the end of the exporting. So here we are again with all the exported audio files. I've loaded them all in a blank new Ableton project, and I've put all the audio files on their own audio track. I've also renamed each track so it matches the audio clip's title. I always like to sort my tracks so that the most important track is on top and the least important track is at the bottom. This again makes the mixing a bit easier since you can just work from left to right in the session view. Now, as you can see, all my clips are different lengths, which is weird since I exported the exact same time period from the original project, right? I can tell you why. Ableton tends to warp long audio clips, which is a great feature, but not for this mixdown task. So I'm going to select all 7 audio clips, and then I'll turn off the warp mode for all these clips. With all 7 clips selected, you can turn this off for all tracks at once. Now each track should have the same length. If not, it's because you have to adjust the start position for each clip. You can do this by opening up each clip and dragging the start marker all the way to the left. After you've done this, each track will have the same length. Okay, so now everything is prepared for the mixdown process. Let's get started. First, I'll zoom in a bit on the drums and solo this track. As you can see in the waveform itself, the kick drum alone is a lot quieter than the kick drum and snare drum combination. I want these to peak at the same level, so I'm going to add a limiter to this track. You can use Ableton's stock limiter for this, or another limiter if you don't like Ableton's limiter. I set the ceiling to 0 dB and then slowly raise the gain while keeping my eye on the gain reduction meter. I want the kick drum to trigger the limiter just slightly, so when I set the gain to +3 decibels, you can see that the snare drum already triggers the limiter, but the kick drum doesn't. So I can raise the gain a bit more until I can see that the kick drum also triggers the limiter. Now the whole drum track will peak at 0 dB, which is what I want for now. I also like to turn off the auto release setting. By setting the release manually, you can hear the drums become louder and more snappy with a shorter release. So I'll stick to that. Now I add an EQ8 before the limiter, just to scoop off that low sub-frequencies the kick drums doesn't need. This will make the kick drum to sub-bass relation a lot cleaner. It might not be that audible to you, but the difference in the final mix can be pretty big. Okay, on to the sub-bass track. On this track, I like to add an EQ8, which will again scoop out the very low frequencies below 30 Hz, since these cannot be heard by the human ear, so we don't need those. In this case, the sub now is already 1 dB quieter after this small little cut. I also like to low pass it so that whenever there is a high frequency element in the audio clip, like a small click or whatever, it will not be heard. Onto the mid-range bass. This one sounds pretty fat already, but there are some things I can do to make this just a little bit better. First, I drop in an EQ8 to scoop the low frequencies out of there, since those are added by the sub bass. I already did this step in the production project, but I do this again to be absolutely sure there are no sub frequencies in this layer. Now I think that it sounds a little bit too thin in the low frequencies, which I probably should have fixed in the production stage, but no worries, we can still fix that right now. I'm going to make a wide boost around the low mids. This will make the main bass seem fatter in the low frequencies, but it will also boost the other bass sounds. On this bass line, it actually works really well, so no need to go into the production project again to fix things. I also make a little wide cut after the wide boost. This is also to make the low end seem to be even more prominent in the mix. Most of the high mids and highs will be filled in by the effect sounds anyway. Okay, on to the synth section. You can see that the synth section has quite a lot of spikes in its waveform, so I'm going to flatten those out a bit. I do this by using a limiter. I turn up the gain until I see the gain reduction meter move. Make sure the ceiling is at 0 dB. So the gain reduction starts working if the signal becomes louder than the 0 dB mark. Let's add an EQ8 too, and just high pass it at 100 Hz to be sure that there are no sub-frequencies in there. So, for the vocals, I don't think I need to do that much to it, since it's already pretty solid. Let's add an EQ8 for now, without changing any settings, since I think I'll need that EQ at the end of this video. On the percussion track, the only thing I need to do is adding an EQ8 and high passing it at 100 Hz again, just to be sure. Then the effects track is cool. I noticed something weird and I'll show you what. If I zoom in on the start of each crash sound, you can see this really weird stuff going on in the waveform. No idea how that happened, but it does mean that since that is the loudest part in the waveform, the effects track came out very quiet. So I need to bring that level up, and I also need to flatten that weird spike so it doesn't clips the output. Let's add a limiter to this track, a ceiling of 0 dB, and raise the gain until the gain reduction starts working. I can push this up even further. Let's set it at the maximum setting. Now I just back it down a little bit, finally add an EQ8 in there to get rid of any possible low frequencies. Great! All the pre-mixing work is now done. So now I move over to the session view. You can do this by pressing the Tab key on your keyboard. Here you can see the mixer of Ableton. Let's drag this up so we can see the actual peak meter, which gives us the precise peak level of each track. So these are a little bit hard to read in my skin. Let's change the skin for now so all of you can see it clearly. So now you can see that when the track plays, this peak meter changes to a value. This is the amount of decibels the track is playing at. Now, for a good mixdown, I find it best to start with the drums peaking at minus 10 dB. So I dialed it in for now. Then I take down all the other tracks. So now things become easy because I know that my drums are peaking at precisely 0 dB. So if I put my drums at minus 10 dB, it will be peaking at precisely minus 10 dB. Pretty easy, right? Now I can start adding in the next track, which will be the sub bass. I raised the sub bass to just below the drums. This will be a good starting point. I always keep my eye on the master channel. I'm aiming to get my final mix around minus 6 dB. So let's add in the mid-range bass until it sounds good with the drums and sub. Okay, so just below the sub bass it sounds pretty good to me. See, if you look at the first 3 tracks, everyone is just a little bit quieter than the one before. Now the first one was meant to be the most important, so that one is obviously the loudest. Let's raise the synths to the desired level. They can be a little bit higher than the mid-range bass probably, since the mid-range bass is not playing when the synths are playing. That sounds good to me. Okay, so now I balance the vocal track against the synth track I just did. The vocals are already very loud from itself due to heavy compression, so they can be a bit lower in volume. So now I can do the percussion track, which again will be a bit lower than the previous track. Finally, I need to raise the effects track, which will fill everything up and bring the track to life. Mostly this track will be mixed at a very low volume compared to all the other tracks. Okay guys, so this is the part at which my computer decided to stop recording last week, but I'll go through the minor changes I made. On the drums track I added a tiny bit of high frequencies in the EQ, just to make them punch through the mix a bit easier. At the sub track I didn't change anything, but at the mid-range bass I decided to bring the level up a bit more. So now it's actually louder than the sub, but it was what sounded the best, so I had to do it. On the synths I dropped the low mids just a little bit with an additional parameter. This made the synth sound a tiny bit clearer. I also boosted the high frequencies just a tiny bit. Okay, so for the vocals I did the boost in the high frequencies. This made the vocals come through a bit better. On the percussion I also scooped out a little bit of low mids, and I've also boosted a little bit of high frequencies. Then on the effects track I did something very cool. I basically made a boost at the high frequencies with a very sharp Q. But then I switched to this EQ curve at the bottom, which basically boosts everything above the set frequency. Then I've added another audio track. I'll rename this to Pre-Master now. I did this since the volume of all tracks together became a little bit louder than -6 dB, but the overall mix sounded very good. So instead of going through each track on its own and taking the volume down, which might probably fuck up my mixdown, I decided to use an audio track to drop the volume back to the -6 dB on the master channel. I've routed each audio track through this pre-master track, and I've set the audio track to the insert mode by activating the INS button. Now all the tracks run through the final pre-master track. If I play the drop section, you can see the pre-master track is peaking at -6 dB, which is what I want. Okay, so now I'm going to fatten everything up a bit more. For the drums I have this nice little compression plugin by Cytomic called the Glue, which comes with a very nice list of presets. For a final drum bus I really like the Rock Parallel Room preset. This is basically just a parallel compression preset. I just play a bit with the range and makeup gain until I get what I like. I really want to bring out those low frequencies in the drums. Then I can also high pass the parallel signal so the low frequencies are not affected by the compression. I also bring the dry wet up just a little. Now I'm going to add sausage fatten to each track, but just a tiny bit, so it fattens up every track just a little. A tiny bit of somewhere between 1 to 10% for each track can do a lot already. Let me add those for all tracks right now. Right, so now the overall volume has increased. I can show you by bringing up the pre-master. Just watch at the peak level. So indeed it became almost 2 dB louder. So let's bring the pre-master track down by another 2 dB. Now I'll add a final sausage fattener to the pre-master track with only 2% fatness. This will glue everything nicely together. By doing that, the master became another 2 dB louder, so I need to bring the pre-master track down another 2 dB. Now, I'm pretty happy with the end result. Nice. That was it for this week's tutorial, guys. Next week I'll dive into the mastering process by using iZotope's Ozone 5. See you next week.